My name is Dave Alberg. This is a joy to be back with everybody today. This is my second presentation with Sifters. I came down to Sarasota, gosh, Smitty, it must have been around 2019. It was pre-pandemic, and gave a presentation on the German U-boats off the North Carolina coast and NOAA's efforts at the time to create a national marine sanctuary to protect them. And then we were trying to do one last December on the in preparation for the anniversary of the launch of the USS Monitor, the Civil War ironclad, but had some challenges with the pandemic going on. So it's good to be back with everybody, and hopefully bring you a topic that you will find different and very interesting. As Smitty said, I was in my former capacity, was with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for about almost 16 years, where I was the superintendent for the Monitor National Marine Sanctuary out of Newport News, Virginia. Our project there was to conserve and treat the remains of the Civil War ironclad USS Monitor, and we also were involved in a lot of work on documenting and working to preserve World War II shipwrecks losses off the North Carolina coast. But about a year and a half ago, a terrific opportunity for me came up to try something different. And so I packed the family up and moved west to Las Vegas, and specifically to a little town called Boulder City, just outside the Hoover Dam, to begin a career with the Park Service. And it has been super challenging, super interesting, and one of the best decisions that I've made. So tonight, what I'm going to talk about is some of the discoveries, quite frankly, that I've made over the last year. I am not an archaeologist by training, but am responsible for the overall protection and the development of policies and preservation plans for Lake Mead and the Park Service here. And I have a terrific staff that I will talk about a little bit further when we get into a description of Lake Mead. But for me, this has been such a departure from the work at NOAA that when Smitty asked if I'd be interested in doing a talk, I thought this would be cool because it is such a departure from what I'd been doing before. So with that, let's get into it. So for those of you who may not know what the Park Service's mission is, and I'm hoping that all of you do, at least fundamentally, National Park Service preserves unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and other generations. And that's a super cool mission. We are one of the oldest agencies in the federal government. I don't know the exact number, but we're certainly close to about 400 Park Service units, maybe a little north of that, across the country. And they range everything from historic sites to historic districts to national parks, national monuments, national battlefields, and everything in between. Lake Mead, the site that I work at, is, again, as Smitty said, about 24 miles or so outside of Las Vegas. We are 1.5 million acres of real estate protected by the Antiquities Act and the National Park under the Park Service. And hopefully, when we get to questions and answers, I'd be certainly interested in how many folks have been out here. But it is central southern Nevada, and we sit right on the edge. Arizona is probably a 10-minute drive from here. California is probably about an hour south of here, but really positioned in a unique place for archaeology and for history. And we also are in an amazing place for climate, which I'll talk a little bit about here in a moment. So for most folks, and certainly the Hoover Dam plays a really, really critical part of the story of why the Park Service is here. If it were not for the Hoover Dam and the establishment of Lake Mead, this national recreation area would not be here. But I'm not going to talk too much about the Hoover Dam today. The Hoover Dam was established. I'll give a little background on the timeline, but the Hoover Dam was and is managed by the Bureau of Reclamation. It is still a power generating reservoir, and it was really created for a couple purposes. One, hydroelectric power, and then of course as a water source for irrigation throughout the desert Southwest. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. If you've never seen the Hoover Dam, I strongly encourage you. One of the nice things about being in Las Vegas is that the flights from just about everywhere in the country are pretty cheap. You can get flights from the East Coast, Baltimore and Richmond and other places sometimes for under a couple $100, and get to see some of these amazing things. It is truly one of the wonders of the world, and I strongly encourage you, if you've not been here, to come out and check it out. I will draw your attention to one thing in this slide. If you look at the top above the edge of the dam, on the lake itself, you'll see a white ring, and we're going to talk about that in a couple minutes as well. But that's the bathtub ring. But try to keep that vision in your mind for a little later. So, as Smitty said, the Hoover Dam was formally dedicated in 1935. Congress granted authority for the construction of the dam, originally called the Boulder Dam, in 1928. Dedicated in 35, but construction really ran from 1931 to 1936. Formation of Lake Mead and the filling of the reservoir began in 1935, less than a year before the Hoover Dam construction was actually completed. The area surrounding Lake Mead was originally protected as a bird refuge in 1933, and then later was established as the Boulder Dam Recreation Area in 1936. The name was changed to the Lake Mead National Recreation Area in 1947, and the Park Service had management responsibility for the lake and its resources, although it still was considered part of the Bureau of Land Management and Bureau of Reclamation, those other federal agencies. And then in 1964, the area was expanded to include an area called Lake Mojave, which is south of the Hoover Dam along the Colorado River, and its surrounding areas, and became the first national recreation area to be designated as such by the Congress of the United States. Of course, the water is a super important part of Lake Mead. We get approximately 8.5 million visitors a year here at Lake Mead. Many of them come to enjoy access to the lake for boating, houseboating, fishing, kayaking, and a number of other waterborne recreation uses. But I want to focus today, especially since we're talking about archaeology, to throw a couple slides of what the rest of Lake Mead looks like, those areas that don't have, that aren't focused on the water. And the establishment of the recreation area took into account some of those other things: paleontological resources, geological resources, scenic beauty, and a whole slew of the history, and a whole other list of reasons that Congress determined that this was an important thing to do for the American public. And so beyond just getting onto the lake and boating, we have a significant number of hiking trails, and we have people that come here from around the world to see wildlife and to bird watch, and we also have 9 different wilderness areas that are designated within the boundaries of Lake Mead. So the management, my job is, as I said earlier, is I'm responsible for kind of the cool stuff at the park. There are a number of different divisions, but the division that I oversee looks after the natural resources, the wildlife, and the vegetation programs, and the cultural resources as well. Under cultural resources, we have a park archaeologist, we have a museum curator, and we also have a cultural resource manager that currently is vacant, but we'll be filling that shortly. And so it's a relatively small team. The rest of the division includes some of the smartest people I've ever worked with that are experts, again, in some of the endangered species in the park and the other resources that we look after. But I'll focus today on the cultural side. And on the cultural resources, some of the things that we focus on are obviously archaeology, both prehistoric and historic sites, historic structures, cultural landscapes and traditional cultural properties, ethnographic resources, and then of course our museum collections and archives, which I'll talk about in a second. As I said, all told, we have 1.5 million acres in the park boundary. 185,000 of those acres are submerged below the waterline. And that number changes all the time. It is becoming a smaller number, unfortunately, for reasons that I'll get into later. But still a very big area with a lot of material that has been inundated since the 1930s. On the land side, we have approximately 1,000 terrestrial archaeological sites, and on average, only about 5% of the park, all told, has been surveyed. And by survey, I mean an archaeological survey. So we believe that there are probably tens of thousands of other sites and resources that are in the park that are yet to be discovered, managed, and protected. Some of our concerns from a management perspective are, especially given that this is a recreation area, are the impacts from human activity. We have everything from boaters and fishermen, as I described, but also people that want to four-wheel, hikers, people that get permits to go into some of the back countries, and all of those things pose potential conflict with resources, especially if they haven't been identified yet. Some of our tribal partners, because we're so central in the Southwest, I won't go through all of these, but we deal for the most part with about 20 tribes, excuse me for coughing, here in Lake Mead. Colorado River Indian tribes, the Fort Mojave tribe, the Wallapai, the Havasupai, the Hopi, the Navajo. Tribes that have been here much longer than the National Park Service, and many of these communities are still living in the very areas that historically and traditionally they lived in for hundreds, if not some cases thousands of years. So a very rich history from a Native American perspective, and one that affords us a great opportunity to work with and learn from these people as well. Our prehistoric resources in the park include archaic period sites. We have a lithic procurement and campsite, Virgin River ancestral Puebloans, the Anasazi, in the northern portion of Lake Mead. They date from 300 BC to 1150 AD. The Lost City Museum in Overton, Nevada, which is not part of the Park Service, but a good partner of the Park Service in Lake Mead. The Patayan and Yuman, which covers the southern portion of Lake Mead and Lake Mojave. They date from 800 to about 1800 AD. And then the Southern Paiute, who probably came into this area around 1200 AD. And as I said earlier, many of these communities are still living roughly in the areas that they called their homeland, their ancestral homeland. Our prehistoric resources include artifact scatters, rock art, rock shelters, the remains of pueblos, roasting pits, and mining. And as I'm reading through this, there's actually another whole category that I won't go into today, but certainly would be remiss if I didn't mention it. And that is paleontological resources. Lake Mead is sort of the mothership for two other parks in the area. One is Grand Canyon Parashant National Monument, and one is Tule Springs National Fossil Beds. Grand Canyon Parashant is probably about, I don't know, maybe 60, 70 miles outside of Las Vegas, maybe a little further than that. And Tule Springs Fossil Beds is literally in Las Vegas, just on the edge of the town. In the case of Tule Springs, has some of the most incredible Pleistocene fossil beds that can be found. And some of that carries into Lake Mead as well. But I won't talk too much about that, and we'll focus on more of the cultural stuff. One of the areas that was heavily documented before inundation was the Lost City. This is a picture of the gentleman who did, I think it's fair to say, most of the early documentation and the most extensive documentation of these Pueblo sites, and that's Dr. Harrington. This is him taken in 1934, so just about a year before the dam began to fill up, and these sites are again in the northern part of Lake Mead, but were all wiped out when the water came up. So significant numbers of artifacts were taken, not by the Park Service, but by early archaeological teams that worked in this area. And a sort of a side note, that poses some challenges for Lake Mead, because now, especially those materials dating are associated with Native Americans and specifically funeral objects, and in some cases even some of the remains. We are now working to get those repatriated back to the tribes, so that they are handled properly. But even fairly recently, we had a gentleman come forward who has material that he had acquired over the years through various sources that we need to dig into, who wants to give those materials up. And so Lake Mead, his national recreation area, and the Park Service is to some extent finds itself in a position where we are sort of the arbiter of some of those artifacts and materials, and working to do the right thing and get them where they need to be. The University of Nevada, Las Vegas Field School does a great deal of work at the Lost City sites. And I should say that it was incorrect for me to say all of them were inundated, because that's not quite true, but some of them were. And so this is one of those sites that was not, that our partners with UNLV are working to create a new generation of archaeologists and also help us understand our past and its connection to the Lost City. If you go to some of these sites today, areas that had been previously submerged, this is typically what you see. That's a plant called tamarisk. It's an invasive species that grows like crazy in those sort of still damp areas where the river, in this case, the Virgin River and the Muddy River, which feed into Lake Mead, have retreated. And so, and of course, having been underwater for nearly 80 years, it poses all sorts of other challenges to an archaeologist, both from the activity of the vegetation and the negative impacts that has, but of course silting and other more contemporary deposition of materials that sort of soften the face of the landscape and makes finding some of these sites more difficult. Here is a pueblo, the remains of a pueblo, again near Overton, that was associated with the Lost City. And you can see how different that looks from sites like Mesa Verde and other places that where you may be familiar with a more classic example of a pueblo today. Because of the size of Lake Mead, we also sort of straddle the Colorado River. We straddle two states, so Nevada to the west and then Arizona to the east. But if you go south of the Hoover Dam and follow the Colorado River, or go on Interstate or Highway 95 down through the town of Searchlight, Nevada, and towards the town of Laughlin, Nevada, you'll come to a place called Grapevine Canyon. This photo was taken in 1946. You can see up there, unfortunately, some graffiti that was done in this area in about 2003. But it is, and I will admit that I went there for the first time just about 6 weeks ago. It is one of the most impressive places that you will find. It is covered with petroglyphs that date anywhere from about 800 to several thousand years of age. The preservation is remarkable, and other than that one example of the vandalism, for the most part, has been left intact with and in relatively good shape. These petroglyphs they cover all sorts of areas at the entrance to this area, Grapevine Canyon, which I should mention also, and I won't do it a disservice by trying to interpret it myself, but it plays a really important part of the origin story of a number of the tribal communities that live down here, one amongst them being the Wallapai. And this is where they believe they came from. The canyon leads up to Spirit Mountain, which again has really deep meaning for a lot of the peoples that live here today, and certainly the ancestral peoples. But Grapevine Canyon and the petroglyphs there mark the entrance to this area. It is within the boundaries of the National Park Service, and so it is protected. But if you, again, get out here, this is one area that you would really, really miss if you didn't take the time and go and see it. It's probably about maybe an hour and a half south of Las Vegas. Again, back to some of the other archaeological resources that we find in the park. We find rock shelters that are still in existence. And I should say that we work very closely with the state of Nevada and the state of Arizona, and a group of volunteers that are site stewards that help us do the monitoring on these sites. Our staff within the Cultural Resources group also works very hard to educate the rest of the staff. So primarily the visitor resource protection, the law enforcement rangers that you would see when you come to a park play a really important role in identifying and identifying these sites, and also looking for any changes to them, potential vandalism, even things like heavier use patterns where we can perhaps get ahead of vandalism or damage to the sites through signage, education, and outreach. But I will say that in my year and a half here, I've been very impressed with the overall sense of ownership and stewardship all the National Park Service employees feel towards these resources, and how we work as a team to make sure, to the best of the extent possible, that they are protected and, of course, interpreted. So that was sort of an overview of some of the prehistoric resources and the older resources, but I want to talk about a little bit about some of the contemporary resources and historic resources, many of them which, of course, were associated with the Hoover Dam. So some of these predate the establishment of the Hoover Dam. Others obviously are associated with its construction. And then there are some other places in the park that have significance to Park Service history, not associated with the dam or its construction. So talking about some of those places, within the Hoover Dam, within the Lake Mead National Recreation Area, we have a couple of Army forts or former fortifications. We have sites associated with early travel along the Colorado River. There are some towns. St. Thomas was mentioned earlier, and I'll talk about that. Ferry crossings that were important. The Colorado River, for those of you who have never seen it, as you would imagine, can be a pretty menacing obstacle to get across. But there were places and seasons of times of the year where it was possible to get across the Colorado River, and those places have played an important part of the early settling of the West. Ranches, mining, and tourism are all some of the examples of the sites here within Lake Mead. So Smitty mentioned St. Thomas, kind of a cool story, actually a very cool story. It was founded by Mormon settlers in 1865, heading west out of Utah. And it was, this is a satellite image. It was unfortunately inundated with the filling of the dam. But the remains of this town have surfaced on a number of occasions, about half a dozen times over the last 80 years, and certainly now today are definitely out. So you can see those green lines are survey marks where we found archaeological or cultural resources, and they line up pretty nice. Even now, out of the water, you can clearly see that they form the grid of an early town. The Mormons eventually left St. Thomas, and other settlers came in. And the town, I don't know what the final population was sort of at its height, but many of those settlers moved to other surrounding areas like the town of Overton in the Moapa Valley. And this is by the time, by 1935, the town for the most part was abandoned. There were not that many people living in the town, if at all, but many of the structures and other materials were still there. So this is before submersion. This is the Gentry house. And then in 2007, here is what that looks like today. So not being a architectural historian or an archaeologist, but on one hand, you could say that the preservation has been pretty solid. On the other hand, if you get up close, because of the drying and the wetting and the drying and the vegetation that is now beginning to, that tamarisk that's coming in there, the mechanical weathering on these sites has been pretty brutal. So our team, the state, and some of our other partners have worked hard to document these sites, but we also get into some interesting challenges from a management perspective, in that visitors who are allowed to go down to this area, who for a generation or more have been trained to pick up litter when they find it, will oftentimes, in fact, when they get to St. Thomas, will be collecting artifacts, glass bottles, other things that look like trash, more contemporary trash. And so those materials are oftentimes picked up and they're left in little piles with good intentions, but unfortunately they take those artifacts out of context, and then it makes it tougher for us to fill in the gaps on the historic record. But again, through education and outreach and our partners through the Site Stewards program, we work to try to help people understand, if you find something, leave it. As we used to say in the dive community, take only pictures, leave only bubbles. It's the same general principle here with the terrestrial sites. Being Nevada, the Silver State, Lake Mead is also full of the remains of a number of mines. Old mines that operated in some cases until fairly recently, others that were played out decades and decades ago, if not even longer. Certainly very interesting places. They play a really key part of the history of the state and of this area, but they also pose in some cases some pretty significant environmental challenges, because the amount of arsenic and other heavy metals used in the refining process of some of those precious metals, but also just structurally. Things like this are of great interest to the public, not recognizing how dangerous they may be. In many cases, we have ground collapse from places in proximity to these mines, and people don't realize that there are tunnels and chambers underneath the soil. So we have a program here to the best of our ability, seal off some of these mines from the public so that they can't get in there, but also work again with the states and the EPA and other agencies to try to deal with what best we can with some of the environmental ramifications of these operations back years and years before. Old roads. This is we talked about ferries, but this is one of the old roads that was used to get to the ferries. You can see some petroglyphs down there, and even some I'll call it graffiti, but it is historic in nature that has been left on some of these rocks. And then, of course, sites associated specifically with the construction of the Hoover Dam. This is a picture taken pre-1935 during the construction. This is taken from the Mojave, what will become the Mojave River. Lake Mead is on the other side, will be on the other side of that dam. But in Boulder City, which is where the Park Service headquarters are, we have one of these buildings. This is the Railroad Warehouse building, constructed in 1931, I guess through 1932. This is where all the railroad cars were serviced. The engines that then brought materials down to the bottom of Lake Mead, filled with concrete and other material for the construction of the dam. It was purchased in 1936. It is on the National Register of Historic Places and is still actively used by the National Park Service today as a warehouse and support center. We have our carpenter shop in there, a number of offices in there, but it is locally known as the Safety First building for the markings that are on the outside of that building that were left over from the construction of the dam. A number of railroad tunnels. Again, these had rail. This is from Boulder City down, where all the rail cars would be moving aggregate and other materials for the construction of the dam. We have 6 of these tunnels built in 1931. Currently, they are part of a hiking trail, arguably the most visited hiking trail in Lake Mead. have a very important role in the history of the construction of the dam. Super important today as an interpretive trail, but also facing some real challenges. This area is geologically active, and although I have not felt any earthquakes in my time here, ones that take place regularly that you don't feel it's a fairly high number. So 60, 70, 80 years of time has passed, and some of these tunnels are becoming somewhat unstable. So the Park Service is currently looking to fund a project that would stabilize these and make them carry them into for future generations for their use. But that project has got about a $20 million price tag. So as you know, what the Park Service is involved with across the country, and not just here at Lake Mead, but everywhere in terms of deferred maintenance and trying to keep up with the great love the American people have for the Park Service. This just gives you an idea of just one preservation project and what the price tag would be to properly take care and stabilize these tunnels. A clarifier, this is these big tanks that were used as part of the, again, construction of the dam. You can see the railroad behind it, used to clean up materials that would be used in the manufacturing. And some things that personally I've found really interesting near Pierce Ferry on the Arizona side, there are the remains of seismograph stations that were installed in the mid-1930s. They were built as the dam was being filled, with the intent of trying to understand what the seismic impact of creating this gigantic reservoir, the largest man-made reservoir ever made, would be. And the earthquakes that were generated were in the tens of thousands. Some of them as big as 5, 6.0, 7.0, but literally tens of thousands of smaller earthquakes that over the years have subsided. But that amount of water and the weight of it did in fact deflect the crust a little bit. And so the Park Service, the Department of Interior, and a number of other university partners had the foresight to set these stations up to track and monitor the impacts of the filling of the lake while it was happening and afterwards. And they operated till the late 1930s. You can see two of them there. Not super interesting to look at unless you know the history of them, but pretty cool and built to withstand almost anything you could throw at them. All right, and then of course, what's in the water? And I think for the Park Service, as the lake level changes, this is one of the things that we are going to be spending more and more time on. So I'm going to show you a couple very quick slides that sort of bin some of the cultural resources that are found under the water, and then throw it over to a video for about 8 minutes that focuses specifically on the B29. And this video was developed by the National Park Service Submerged Cultural Resource Center, and it can do a much better job than I can in terms of telling you about its history. So this is a photo of one of the National Park Service staff from the SRC, the Submerged Resource Center. They are in Denver, Colorado, and support dive activities across the Park Service, and have done just incredible work documenting sites like the USS Arizona in Pearl Harbor, obviously the B29 at Lake Mead, but are really the go-to team for underwater archaeology within the Park Service. I should also say that in my former capacity at NOAA, the Submerged Resource Center and the expertise from the Park Service were critically important to helping us document the World War II sites off of North Carolina. So we'll come back to this one, but because this is what this video is about. But as Smitty indicated in the title of my talk, focuses on, we have a intact, or relatively intact, B29 bomber that was lost in 1948 in the lake. It was actively being used as a test bed for some pretty incredible technology, and had a mishap, flying too low, propeller caught the water, and it went down very quickly. Luckily, nobody died on the B29, but it was, and the military and the Park Service knew relatively where the location of this B29, but for the most part, it was not publicly known until the early 2000s. Then it was found, and the Park Service came in and did, and has continues to do, both annual surveys on the B29 to assess its condition, but also to better understand the history, the causes of its loss, and to make sure that this story is not lost. But we'll come back to that one here in just a couple slides. And then, of course, sites associated with the construction of the dam. So there's you can see a number of these large tanks that I showed you, the aggregate plants where gravel was sorted for inclusion in the concrete that was used in the construction. And in fact, whole roads, service buildings, street signs, all of that, once the construction was done and the lake began to fill, was just left in place. So the Park Service's Submerged Resource Center has done a tremendous job helping us document those sites as well, so that they are documented with the intent of making them accessible as part of, eventually as part of an underwater trail system that scuba divers and other water recreation advocates can access. So the story of the B29 is, as I said, it's a cool story. It also is going to be one of the biggest challenges for us in terms of preservation. As the water level drops, the thing that had protected this particular airplane for so long was the depth and the fact that its location was not known. But that is all changing. So by the end of this year, what was a couple hundred feet of depth beyond the limits of a recreational diver is now going to be probably about 40 or 50 feet, so well within the depth that an avocational diver can get to. The water, of course, is getting warmer, more oxygenated, and more of a dynamic environment because of the lack of depth. And so the Park Service has got to start thinking now about what that will look like and what our best approach is to protect it. But again, I will send the link, that way everyone has got it at the end, and then encourage you to go check out this video. It's on the National Park Service website, so you can get some good information about its history as well. So back to other sites within Lake Mead. I mentioned that we have some sites that are associated with the modern era National Park Service sites, and we'll talk about those a little bit here. So the one of the programs the Park Service was involved with in the 1960s was a project called Mission 66. This was a 10-year Park Service initiative to significantly increase the services offered to our visitors, picnic areas, boat ramps, other facilities. And this was a nationwide program that was implemented. It also coincided with the Park Service's 50th anniversary, but many of those sites now are enough time has passed that they are listed as on the National Register of Historic Places. And so the Park Service, I'll show you a couple pictures of some of those, has worked hard to document those sites as well. We have historic aircraft areas in the park that again go back and are important because of their historic contribution to the area. This is one at Pierce Ferry on the Arizona side. I should also mention, of personal interest to me, for anyone who's an aviation person, that one of the sort of side stories for Lake Mead that's pretty interesting is Howard Hughes's involvement with Lake Mead during preparation to fly the Spruce Goose. Hughes did a lot of training, borrowed a US Navy seaplane from the government, and did practice takeoff and landings in Lake Mead in preparation to fly that airplane, until he crashed that Navy seaplane, killing 2 people whose remains were never found, and putting himself in the hospital for many months. But ironically, that airplane was recovered, restored, and is in a place, I want to call it Fun in the Sun Air Park in Lakeland, Florida. And it is the only surviving example of that particular type of Sikorsky seaplane, but also has a pretty cool Howard Hughes connection to Lake Mead as well. This is our headquarters building today. It was constructed in 1954. It's been in continual use by the Park Service. This is in Boulder City, and again is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And then a number of developed areas, which we have just completed this last year, a series of determinations of eligibility for their listing on the National Register. So although some of them have not yet been listed, they have been deemed eligible by the Nevada and Arizona SHPOs. And they include campgrounds, ranger stations, comfort stations, even some park housing and amphitheaters, all that were established and created during this period in the 1960s to expand the services offered to our visitors across the Park Service. I mentioned we have a museum curator and a pretty extensive museum collection program. It includes natural resources, some of those paleontological and natural resource specimens, artifacts, park archives. Currently, we have approximately 100,000 objects that are curated here at Lake Mead, 74,000 objects curated at the NPS Western Archaeological and Conservation Center in Tucson that are associated with Lake Mead and the lands that it occupies, and then approximately another 2,500 objects curated at the Museum of Northern Arizona and at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And then lastly, some of the traditional cultural properties here within the boundaries of Lake Mead that are listed on the National Register of Historic Places: Gold Strike Canyon, Sugarloaf Mountain, Spirit Mountain, which I mentioned at the beginning of our talk, which is a very significant site for a number of the Native American peoples in the area. We have some areas of Black Canyon and Willow Beach that are culturally sensitive areas, and sacred areas, which includes the Colorado River itself and Salt Song Trail. These areas may include artifacts, they may include petroglyphs, or other evidence of use by Native American communities, and or again, traditional cultural properties that the Park Service is responsible for. So lastly, I want to just talk about what is happening here at Lake Mead. In fact, I did a presentation this morning on the changing lake levels. The lake has dropped approximately 140 feet, maybe a little bit more than that, 150 feet from its full capacity. The last time it was at full capacity was in about 2000. And I think it is important to note that it is a reservoir. It's a man-made reservoir. So fluctuations in water level have always been part of the story here. In fact, I mentioned St. Thomas has been exposed and inundated a number of times over the years. But about 20 years ago, right after we sort of hit that high flow period in Lake Mead's history, something began to change and has continued to happened since 2000, and that is that the lake level on average has continued to drop about 12 feet per year, and there's really two reasons behind it. One is the Colorado River between Lake Mead and Lake Powell in southern Utah at Glen Canyon, and the river that connects them. You almost need to think of them from the Bureau of Reclamation's perspective as part of a larger single unit. And so what happens is that water fills up in the upper Colorado River Basin, Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado. That water comes into the Colorado River, fills Lake Powell, which generates hydroelectric power and provides water for communities in Arizona, Utah, and in that area. And then an amount of water is released from Glen Canyon down to Lake Mead in an annual allocation. Now we get some water from local rainfall, but I can tell you after living here a year, that's not much. And some from the tributaries of the Virgin, Muddy, and some smaller rivers. But, and then it is released out of the Hoover Dam after generating power and goes, as Smitty said, to support about 25 million people in Southern California and Arizona, Nevada, and even through treaty to the government of the country of Mexico, which has is allowed a portion of this water because the water originally flowed all the way into the Gulf of California before the construction of any of these projects. So two things have happened. One is the amount of water that is being used exceeds the amount of water going into this larger system, whether it is agriculture projects in Colorado or Utah or Arizona, to the agricultural demands of Southern California. The bottom line is that the allocations that are currently in place exceed and have exceeded for years the amount of water coming in. So the result was this roughly 12-foot drop per year. But in the last few years, there's another factor which is actually a little bit more alarming, at least to me and to the scientific community, and that is the impacts of climate change. And what is sort of been the call all along is, well, it's a reservoir. There will be years when it goes down faster than in other years, but one good snowpack, what we need is a good snowpack in the Colorado Rockies, and this will all be fixed. And historically, that's been the case, that a couple years of diminished snowfall will be evident in diminished waters in Lake Mead, but then the reverse is true, that you get some heavy snowfalls and the lake comes back up. But that hasn't been happening. And the reason for that is because as average temperatures in the Southwest and weather patterns in the southern part of the United States have begun sort of established themselves, we are seeing hotter, drier conditions, which results in, even when we have years where the water, where we have increased snowpack, the result is less of that water ever makes it to the Colorado River. Most of it either is absorbed directly into the soils or in some cases evaporates back into the atmosphere. So we have a higher carrying capacity because of those temperature increases in the atmosphere of total moisture. And so more of the water is bound up in the soil and in the atmosphere and less of it running through the Colorado River. And so the impacts to that are, especially in this last year, have been a real challenge. These are some of the boat ramps that the remnants of those boat ramps. And if you could turn the camera on any one of these particular photos, you would see boat ramps that climbed 150, 200 feet up the hillside, and in some cases ran for a quarter mile, that year after year have been dropping to the point now where they're, because of the topography still in the, or I should say the bathymetry in the lake, there's no way to continue to expand these. And so you're left with infrastructure that's high and dry. So this is, when we talk about resources for the Park Service and how much money things like that railroad tunnel project would cost to do, we also have to factor in things like this and what it will cost to make sure that we fulfill our commitment to local communities and the economies of Arizona and Nevada, who are directly impacted by the inability to get to the water for boaters and fishermen. To give you an idea, this is the Bureau of Reclamation runs a monthly report showing conditions, and if you will just sort of orient you to this slide for a moment. On this, there's a blue line, which is historic to the left and future projections to the right. And if you look along that, you'll see a green dashed line, which is the current for the next through December 23, the maximum probable inflow from Lake Powell into Lake Mead, which would give us an elevation by the end of December of approximately 1,035 feet, which is really puts, in terms of the ability to get to the water, it basically shuts off all the major launch ramps and marinas in Lake Mead, with the exception of one. And that will require significant investments of moving marinas and boat ramps. The red dashed line shows the maximum most probable, which drops even further down to 1025. And this is just within the next 24 months. Lake Mead and the Hoover Dam will no longer be able to generate power when you get down to about 950. And I would say that a couple years ago, that was an unthinkable probability. But now Lake Powell in Glen Canyon is facing the very real possibility that within the next year to 2 years, that dam may no longer be able to generate power. And Lake Mead, if this trend continues, may see that possibility come up on the horizon in the coming few years as well. So the park is facing some real challenging infrastructure projects. But again, back to the purpose of today's talk, it also presents with each decline of the water level more shoreline and the potential to uncover significant numbers of cultural resources, historic resources that all will also require documentation and work to protect. So it is an interesting, for me, coming from the East Coast and having been involved in sea level rise as sort of the #1 challenge of climate change, to come out here and be dealing with climate change, but in just the opposite capacity, dealing with long-term climate-induced drought. It has been very interesting. However, I will say one of the things that I get asked, does it ever snow out here? And this should put that question to bed. Yes, it does snow very occasionally, and the snow is gone pretty quick. But when it does happen out here, it's certainly a beautiful sight. So with that, let me say thank you to everybody. I will, while we're answering questions, I'll kick it back to you, Smitty, and then throw the link to that video in the chat. But again, thank you for letting me chat with you today, and hopefully it's been of interest to you, and happy to take your questions.